And we're live.
Yay! I'm so excited.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Write With Us Live, a free weekly open access digital writing workshop series. My name is Ariana. I go by Ariana the Poet online on all social media things. And today, Alan is going to be facilitating a really cool workshop on visual poetics. So, Alan, do you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Alan. I go as American Scribble on the internet, and I'm a visual poet, which means that I use visuals in my poetry. Pretty simple. And I didn't always do that. I started doing that probably 4 years ago. And that was after I was able to go back home for the first time since my migration. And my grandma would just stare at me when I was like in the maca writing on my notebook. And she asked me why I was like always like writing, and she was just kind of like looking through the notebook, and she asked me, why does everything look the same? What are you saying? And because she doesn't know how to read or write, I was just like, oh my gosh, like words do all look the same. If somebody just opened a traditional poetry book and flipped through it who didn't know how to read or write, like they would get nothing except for the cover. Like the cover would tell them something, right, about the rest of the book if it was all kind of written in a standard format where the font was the same, the size was the same, the line breaks look similar to each other, and most poems were around the same page length. Like it would really say nothing if you didn't understand either that language or that letter. So I started to think of like, how can I write poetry where my grandmother will be able to, if I ever publish a book, open the book and be like, oh, I know what this is about. And when I was writing my first book, my audience was my mother, my grandmother, and my siblings. My siblings at the time were still, I think one was in elementary school, one was in middle school. So my my practice was with young people in mind and folk who didn't know how to read or write, in like the Western letter in mind. And that's when I was like, oh shit, like photos are really important. How big the font is important. The color of the font. In the past, I have fought with editors to use different colors on my poems because they were like, "Oh, this is not accessible," and I was like, um, "Oh, okay. Let me get my other headphones. Give me a sec."
Someone let us know that it's currently really hard to hear Alan, so they're going to go figure out, going to grab another pair of headphones so we can make sure that everyone can hear both Alan and myself loud and clear so everyone can follow along. So just give us a moment and thank you for letting us know. In the moment, like in the meantime, while Alan is figuring that out, we would love to know where everyone is tuning in from. So if you can let us know in the chat on YouTube Live, let us know where you're coming from today. And Alan is going to get back into it. Let's see. Hey, Alan, welcome back. I think you're on mute right now.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I knew that those headphones were not a good idea. Um, I don't know how much I'll cut, but yeah. So I have a particular investment in visual poetics because it's the way that I reach my family, and it's really exciting because um, last time I saw my mom in person, I showed her some poems that I'm working on, and all 10 of them were visual. One was in the shape of a dragonfly, one was in the shape of a pill, one was in the shape of a volcano, one is in the shape of a map. And she like knew exactly what every poem was about without even reading the words. And I was like, okay. And this workshop is I'm gonna start off by reading a poem from this text called "Of Poetry and Protest" from Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin. And I have the name of the collection on the Google Doc if you are on the Google Doc. And the poem that I'm going to read is from Eva Shockley, and it's titled X Marks the Spot. And I'm going to show it to you, and then I'm going to read it. So this is the poem in the shape of an X. And Eva Shockley is by far one of my favorite poets. I have learned, I think, some of the most information about like the history of Black women in the US through Eva Shockley's poetry and not through academic texts or anything. I mean, poetry is kind of like an academic text because poetry is theory. But I'm also going to be reading poems from Semi-Automatic, which is her collection from 2016. But first, X marks the spot. Affable African, amiable American, affirmative African, amazing American, affectless African, ambulant American, affronted African, amorous American, affordable African, ambidextrous American, afflicted African, amusing American, affixed African, amended American, affirmative ambulance, amazing affront, affordable amusement, ambidextrous affirmation, affectless amateur, amiable affliction, affluent ambivalence, ameliorative affability, affected American, amenable African, African amendment, American afterglow. That is X Marks the Spot by Eva Shockley. Thoughts, Ariana?
I actually have a really hard time, I think, like hearing poems like that aloud. I think that for poems like that, where it's like it's not two phrases, two words, right? Two word phrases for the entire poem that all start with the same letter. I think for me, hearing it aloud, I think it becomes like difficult to differentiate between the meanings of the different words. Whereas if I could see it in front of me, right, like here's where the visual aspect becomes really central to being able to understand the poem or even being able to follow it, right? Because when you hear something that's meant to be perceived visually, right, you can't access it in the same way. So I think when you ask me, like, what are my thoughts are, I would love to see it.
Thank you so much because absolutely, I think that why I love Evie Shockley is because all of her work demands that you sit with it because you can't just witness it at the level of the oral, at the level of the visual, or at the level of like the internal reading. You actually have to read it out loud, stare at it, and it's true because I'm just going to show you. There's huge spaces, right? So I don't know how Evie would read this poem. Like, I don't know if she would read like just this side first and then this side. I read them across. But that's the thing with visuality. Uh, unless you're the person who wrote it, you will never fully know how to read it. And even Evie, like she might read it in different ways depending on the crowd. There are poems that I have that I always read it differently wherever I am, because sometimes it means something else for me. So that's the thing about visuality. You can't assume that you know. Visual poetics refuses mastery. You can't be like, oh, I know what this is about, because also what does the X mark? Like it might mark like an X on a survey on a census, right, for African American. Like it might also mark like X on a map, as in like the moment of arrival, like how did Black folk get to whatever geography you're thinking about. Um, we never really will know what it actually means, and that's called opacity. The right not to know, the right for people to not inquire certain things about your life. Okay, so that's the first poem I want to read. And then the second poem I want to read is also hard to listen to because it's written as if it were um, those standardized tests that you have to select a letter. What are they called?
Multiple choice?
Yes. So the poem is a multiple choice test. And this is from her collection, Semi-Automatic. And it's called What's Not to Liken. It's just one page, so I'll show you the test or the survey. Okay. What's not to liken? The 14-year-old girl was treated like A, a grown woman, B, a grown man. The bikini-clad girl was handled by the cop like A, a prostitute, B, a prostitute by her pimp. The girl was slung to the ground like A, a sack of garbage into a dumpster, B, somebody had something to prove. The girl's braid flew around her head like A, helicopter blades, B, she'd been slapped. The black girl was pinned to the ground like A, an amateur wrestler in a professional fight, B, swimming in a private pool is a threat to national security. The girl's cry sounded like A, the shriek of children on a playground, B, the shrieks of children being torn from their mothers. The protesting girl shackled like A, a criminal, B, a runaway slave, like it or not. And then at the end of the poem, there's an indentation with McKinney, Texas, June 2015. And if you're familiar with there was a video that circulated in 2015 of a 14-year-old Black girl in a public pool who was assaulted by the police. This poem is describing that video, and as a visual poem, it refuses the reproduction of the video. And it also rehistoricizes the video into a longer genealogy of the condition of Black girlhood in the US as it relates to white supremacy and patriarchy. And yeah, like in the comments, what are your thoughts on listening to this multiple choice poem / survey / recounting?
I feel like it's also a hard poem to hear, like particularly because of the brutality that's being described. And I think be something about the form of the poem being in the multiple choice. Like there's a formality to that kind of like test question language that almost makes it read as like cold. And I think that contrasted with the violence that's being described in the lines makes the violence that much more apparent because you can't talk about that kind of violence from a detached place, right? Of those things happening to a human being. And I think like that makes it, I don't know, I think like even harder to hear.
Absolutely. And like you're saying, also like a test means that there is a right answer, right? And this poem is about brutality, assuming that the brutality can be um, explained, and it shouldn't have to be explained. And I think that also because it's multiple choice, as a reader, it makes you decide on the choice. Like you can actually circle the answer and perhaps even read the poem just in the answers that you circled. And actually, that's a reflection of you, what you're choosing to omit or what you're choosing to highlight as the reader. Um, so visual poetics also, as the reader, um, it gives you a sense of also like agency, or it raises the stakes because now you have to decide on directions of the poem. Just like I had to decide on how to read Eva Shockley's poem, depending like from left to right or top to bottom. And then in this one, I'm like, do I read the whole exam or just the questions I would prefer to make it less brutal? Um, and then we have a few comments that I think are coming in. So Cecilia talks about the intelligibility and standardized testing and the ideologies it produces, right? And that's the thing with poetry too. There are certain poems that are made intelligible, like um, a sonnet or a haiku or a tanka poem. But it's like, what about poems that don't come from a studied tradition, but come from a lived tradition? Um, and then let's see. Sun in the Light, it feels like it cuts through arguments and forces you to grapple with what's more true. Right. What will you take as true? What will be your truth as a reader? Um, wow. The AB choice election makes me think of choosing between alternatives, of grappling with two complicated truths. Right. So both can be true, right? But it's a multiple choice. I'm struck by how vivid the choices are, creating these layers of images. Right. There's no actual images and there's no video. Um, and I think it also is about the ethics of how do you talk about something so brutal, but still like develop a critical way in which to witness and think. And the question of whether or not someone can listen/read violence selectively. Absolutely. Both X marks the spot and this one are about that exactly. Because X marks the spot is also as violent as this one. But X marks the spot doesn't render you a body. And this one does. So the answers options are like how we're complicit in participating and choosing how to engage with the brutality of these systems. Right. So if you select an answer, then you are by default selecting a condition in which to explain, in which to be like, oh yeah, this is it. Um, so almost kind of like we shouldn't have an answer. We should refuse to answer these questions. Maybe. Okay, so I'm gonna read the last poem and then we're gonna go into our two writing prompts. And this book, I go to it so many times. I still don't understand a good portion of it, because I think that I'm reading too fast and it demands slower reading. Okay. The last poem I'm going to read is called Philosophically Immune. And I'm particularly reading it because I think it represents our current moment too accurately. Philosophically Immune. Can I deduce the nature of humanity from the relationship of American and multinational pharmaceutical corporations to African women with HIV? Is it natural to test pharmaceuticals on people who are citizens of less powerful nations, members of a devalued gender, representatives of a maligned race? Is it logical? Is it cost effective? Is the nature of the relationship of American and multinational pharmaceutical corporations to African women with HIV economic or human? Economic or humane? Are African women with HIV human? Are African women human? Are Africans human? Are American and multinational pharmaceutical corporations human? Are American corporations human? Are Americans human? Are American corporations citizens? Are Africans American? Are African Americans multinational? Can humans have a relationship to American and multinational pharmaceutical corporations? Are corporations corporeal? Are corporations real? Are corporations corpses? Are corporations gendered? Are women representative? Are humans incorporated? Are humans pharmaceutical? Is HIV pharmaceutical? Is nature pharmaceutical? Is nature humane? Is nature natural? Are nations natural? Are nations raced? Are nations corporations? Are nations cost effective? Is nationality a test? Can I deduce the humanity of the reader from the relationship of the reader to American and multinational pharmaceutical corporations? Can I deduce the nature of the reader from the relationship of the reader to African women with HIV? So the whole poem is, I mean, it does have a shape. It's a square. It doesn't use any punctuation marks except question marks, and separating every question is a approximation sign. Yeah. Thoughts on this?
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I just said thoughts on this.
What's an approximation sign? I don't actually know what that is.
Oh, not approximation, but the squiggly line on top of the enye.
Oh, okay, got
What do you
you.
call that?
I don't know. Because when you held the book up to the camera, it looked almost like just dashes, but now I see that they're like a little wavy.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I feel like my initial thoughts are, is the whole poem questions?
Yes, everything is a question.
Uh-huh. I feel like that became more. I feel like I didn't notice the questions at the beginning, but I think it was when the questions started to have similar sentence structures, where only like a word was changed, or a word was the same but got moved somewhere else in the question. And I think the constant repetition of the changing words, also like changing the meaning of the question that's being asked. And I think, yeah, the question, "Are nations natural?" stuck with me a lot, because then it also sort of from then follows like, "Are corporations natural?" I also really appreciated the question, "Are," it was something like, "Are multinational corporations or pharmaceutical corporations human?" And I feel like a lot of what I'm receiving from this poem is like a critique of global capitalism and neoliberalism. The idea that like corporations are individuals, right? That they're just like you. Um, yeah, yeah. It was overwhelming.
Overwhelming. Thank you. I really appreciate hearing how, in your experience, you caught the questions later, because I think it also tells us about how like sometimes language betrays us or sound betrays us. Because sound is something we're supposed to, like, if we are people who are able to hear, sound is something we're supposed to understand. But what happens when we don't understand the sound? And it also, because the question is caught later, it's something about like the topic is African women with HIV, right? It's about witnessing, uplifting, centering, like supporting, advocating with. But also, if you don't catch, if you, the fact that like the questions are cut later, it's also like, what happened? Like we lost the whole beginning that sets up the hyperhumanity of the African woman with HIV. So I really appreciate like hearing that from you. And then the latest comment that just came in says, "I like the visual of a box. It makes me feel boxed in by these questions that really have no answer." Boxed in. Thank you, sir. Alexis, visually looks like a prescription label on drug packaging, and the poem is heavy with the horror, like the history of pharmaceutical industry and medical science history. I love that we're thinking about the visual aspect now. Okay, because one could look at this poem and be like, oh yeah, it's just a regular poem, right? But because this is a visual workshop, you're thinking in a visual way. A poem is not just a poem, it has a body. All poems have bodies. Okay, so a drug packaging. And I think that you might be onto something, Alexis, because I'm going to show you one of her last poems in this book. It's actually this. So yeah, she's definitely critically thinking about labels, categories. Priscilla, the way the question shortened at the center of the poem and expand out again at the end created this sense of moving in and back out for me. Moving in and out. Absolutely. I'm still looking at, okay. Thank you. So what I want to have us do now is we have 2 prompts. And the prompts are pretty open-ended. And what I ask is, I'm going to share my process of writing visual poems. When I am no longer invested in thinking of line breaks as I write. Yes, Cecilia, and the continuing misogynoir. Right. I think that across the three poems, that's where we're seeing the everyday ways in which misogynoir not only show up, but materially manifest in order to create intimate domestic violences that may be misrecognized. And I think we get a lot of that in the first poem, where there is no body, but there is all of these words representing experiences that, like, we know are there. And maybe we just haven't named all of those words, but now we have. Um, so for the writing exercise, we're gonna write for 10 minutes, 5 minutes and 5 minutes. I'm gonna put a timer for each. And the way that I approach visual poetry is that I no longer think about line breaks. And I'm gonna ask you that if you're somebody who really is down with like line breaks and kind of has like a system that really works for you, to try not to think of this as these next 10 minutes as poetry. Maybe think about it as a journal entry where you're just writing in, like, a journal, not really skipping any lines, or think about it as a paragraph, or maybe think about it as a short prose. Um, because these questions are actually questions I want answers to from y'all as people who are in this workshop and witnessing, because I don't know who you are. But the first question, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Okay, I'm about to share my screen, and I'm going to share my Google Doc. Okay. So the first question I want you to think, or the first prompt is, what is a narrative of people who move with your racial and your ethnic experience? So just pick one, your racial or your ethnic experience. And so what is the narrative that people have? And situate it either within the state that you live in, or the neighborhood that you live in, or the spaces you most frequently. So, for example, I might talk about the narrative that folk in Oakland have of Black folk. So people in my community, where I live in Oakland. So I would just write for 5 minutes on that. I just want you to pick. I want one for you to racialize yourself. What is your race? To be more explicit, and what is a narrative that people have of your race, or what is your ethnicity, and what is the narrative that people have of your ethnic group, in whatever space you currently live in or move in or frequent the most. Maybe the space you frequent the most is your work or school or the doctor's office, whatever it may be. So I'm going to time it for 5 minutes because this is just short prose. I just want you to reflect on your life and just word vomit, but don't skip any lines. Just write. I'm going to put on a timer.
Can I ask a clarifying question, Alan? I think, I think I have questions about like, what exactly do you mean by narrative? Like, are you thinking about like how people of like a certain racial or ethnic experience are perceived by others? Like, are we thinking about like stereotypes that other people might have of the racial or ethnic group we belong to? Or like, just like, what do you mean by narrative?
Thank you. So by narrative, I mean, what is a story that you hear often about people from your own racial group within the place that you live in? So there's a very particular narrative. For example, here where I live in Oakland, there's a very particular narrative of how Blackness looks in Oakland and who Black people are in Oakland. Or for example, if I were to talk about maybe another space that I frequent often, I guess during quarantine, is I live like a 5 minute walk away from the lake. And there's also a very particular narrative that people have of Black folk at the lake. And that's a very different narrative than the general narrative that people have of Black folk in Oakland. So I would just like situate my racial group in a certain space and think about the narratives that I've heard other people have of that. experience, or of that like group of people, that community in that space.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. So 5 minutes start now. We're gonna come back at 12:40 or 1:40 or 2:40 or 3:40. Okay, I'm gonna ask that you put your writing utensils down, whether it be your pens, your pencils, your digits, and that's just kind of like a stream of consciousness, and it's also a space for you to reflect. And now we're gonna move to the next prompt, and there's a reason why I'm doing this fast. Um, Prompt two is, what is your commitment to this moment? And by this moment, I mean this moment, not just the pandemic, but what is your commitment to Black livelihood? What is your commitment to abolition? What is your commitment to liberation? I want you to answer this in the next 5 minutes. Again, just think of it as a journal entry or prose or a paragraph, and we'll reconvene at 46. Okay, those 5 minutes are up. I appreciate learning and stuff. These questions are hard. Can I get like 50 minutes though? um, you get 5. But I promise that you'll have sometime soon. Okay, so let's come back to the live. Ariana, may I ask you what you wrote about generally for either one of the 2 prompts, whichever one you want to talk about?
Sure. I Yeah, I feel like it was easier for me to respond to the first prompt only because it's something I've been thinking about and researching for a very long time. So the language came like more easily to me. Whereas with the second prompt, I have a lot more things crossed out where I was trying to get the language just right. I was like, what do I actually mean? What do I actually mean with that? So for the first prompt, I talked about how Black people in San Antonio are perceived, like what areas of the city people generally understand Black people to be from in San Antonio, and like how do they understand Black Black people in San Antonio, like they're tend to not be perceived as Spanish speakers, um, and tend to also not be perceived, tend to always be perceived as African American unless you see everybody's whole family and you can like identify both of their parents and what their children look like. Usually at the grocery store. Usually you find out at the grocery store. Yeah, so that's what came up for me. Oh, yeah, that and then also that Black people in San Antonio are scarce everywhere but the part of the city they're perceived to be from, though not as scarce as in a city like Austin.
Wow, thank you. Ooh. My mind is just going everywhere because I feel like I've heard you say this before, but I feel like right now you just said it so like this is it. This is how it looks like. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna go back to this doc and just because right now we're at this piece. How do we make what we just wrote visual? And Ariana, based on what you just said, did you write everything in one kind of like paragraph for that prompt?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so because this is a visual workshop and you're thinking about the ways in which Black folk are scarce in San Antonio, and also the ways in which there are certain parts of San Antonio where there are Black folk, right? And you also talk about the grocery store as a location where whole families are at. Um, what would you how would you approach turning what you just wrote in the 5 minutes into a visual piece? Is there anything that comes to mind, or is there one particular image that you want to concentrate on? So you named 3 images. You named the supermarket image with the family. You named the scarcity image. And then you named the abundance in certain areas. Of those 3 images, there's one that you're
I mean, I keep thinking about like looking at San Antonio on Google Maps to like actually being able to point because I'm from the South Side, which is like a very particular area that's bordered by certain highways in San Antonio. Black
okay.
people there are perceived to be like from the East Side, which is a totally different, very like far part of the city from where I'm from.
Okay, so let me just I love this is like my process. So you're talking, so let me just go on Google Maps. What do I
Yeah.
type? Is there like do you want me to type in a specific location?
Um, Maybe like the Carver Cultural Center,
Carver? Like,
like George Washington Carver.
oh gosh. Sorry.
You got it. Oh no, it's just Carver. Like,
Oh, okay. So Carver, what center?
It's actually the second option right there, the community Carver Community Cultural Center. So
Okay.
that's on the that's like exemplifies where the east side of San Antonio is.
Okay. And what do you want, like the whole map? Like what would you like?
Maybe maybe we could do like directions. Um
Whoa, okay.
and
Directions to where?
um the starting point could be Palo Alto Elementary School. That's where I went to elementary school.
To this one?
Yeah, that one.
Okay. Do you want to walk? Do you want to bike? Do you want a train? Do you want a car?
Uh let's do walk.
Okay.
I like that.
2 hours? Okay. So I guess my next question is, what do I do with this? Do you want me to screenshot it, or do you want to just like use it as a reference point? Is this part of the poem, or
I think maybe that's part of a that could maybe be I think like part of a poem. Like yeah, I keep thinking about like other things I could do with the map. So maybe like the central part is like just the map of San Antonio on Google Maps, and then like maybe this is actually like a series of poems where I look
oh,
at different parts on the map. And this
okay.
is an example of one of those parts.
Okay, so what I'm gonna do, just hearing you. Okay, also just to let y'all know, this is all like improv, or we did
Yeah.
not script any of this. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to screenshot this and let me just add it to a blank Google Doc. Um, oh my gosh, there's so much open on my laptop. Okay, one sec. Okay, so we have a map. Um, I have no idea what your words are, but I want to give y'all some pointers. Again, I have no idea what you want to do with this map, but um, I'm just using this as an example. So let's say um, I'm Ariana and I'm writing. I have this map in front of me. One thing that I would encourage y'all to play with is you have this in a Google Doc, right? For now, I would suggest maybe just copy and paste everything you just wrote, Ariana, and put it on top of this map just to see it. So let me show y'all how I would do that. So I'm on the Google Doc and I have the image. So I would go here and put adjustments, and then I would go to transparency and make it pretty transparent enough where you can still read it. And then I'm gonna exit out of that and it's transparent. I'm gonna make it smaller so you see it. And then I would probably, in order to add the text that I just wrote, insert, I would probably, where is text box? What? Okay, unsure where the text box option is.
I don't know if Google Docs has a text box
Oh,
option because you can
okay.
write on the whole document, I think. I don't know.
In that case, then I'm gonna go back to adjustments and I'm gonna reset it. And instead, I'm gonna make this a watermark instead. So I'm just gonna take it out, insert. Oh gosh. No, there is a text box option because I've used it before to write concrete poems. Okay, you know what? Let me. Okay, unsure, but what I would do is I would type on top of this. Um, I can open it up on like InDesign, but I wanted it to be super accessible to y'all. And clearly I went wrong somewhere. Oh, let's see.
I just Googled it, Alan. I don't know if
Mhm.
this will be helpful. Um, but Google says to go to insert and then select drawing and then select the text box icon in the menu bar of the drawing window. Does that make sense?
Uh-oh.
Oh. Hmm. Oh, there it is. You see the text box icon?
Save and close. So where's the text box though?
Hmm.
Okay. You know what? Let me make add this onto Canva. So, oh gosh, this is an image I've been working on. But if you all have Canva, it's on canva.com. This is free. And let me just drop it into Canva. This is literally where I make a lot of our stuff. Okay, so we have this map for Ariana's poem. And then I would say, again, I would make it, I would fade it out, the transparency. And let's just add some text to it. Do you have a line, Ariana, that we can add that you would be comfortable us reading?
Let me look at it. Let me look at it. Most Black people here live on the east side.
Okay. Most Black people here. Okay, so when it comes to fonts, the size, the color, the style of the font is really important. Ariana, is there a certain size that you want this to be?
Is there a certain what? Oh, size?
Size? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe a little smaller. Maybe we could see what, like 20 or something like that.
Yeah, so here's 20. Where do you want it? Do you want it on top of the map, in the middle, outside of the map?
Um, I feel like I would want it on top of the map.
Okay, where on top?
Uh, Maybe like to the right of the route. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so, oh wait, you said to the right. So over here-ish somewhere?
Yeah, somewhere over there.
Where?
Right there is perfect.
Okay, do you like that size or do you want it larger or smaller?
I think I do like that size, but I almost yeah, I like it like that.
Okay, and I am doing this live for y'all so that you can just see that visual poetry is about sitting with your poem, right? So Ariana, you just wrote for 5 minutes.
Mhm.
All we did was take one line from your poem,
Mhm.
add it to an image, and this is already, I think, shape-shifting into something.
Mhm.
Um, because if you were to look at this in a book, Ariana, what would you say if this was just the only, like a page in a book?
Like this specific image with this like specific line on it.
Mm-hmm.
What would I think?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I just feel like it gives so much more immediate information than like someone trying to explain the context of this. You know, like it's so immediate. I feel like that's the thing I keep thinking about, because I feel like if I were to try to write, because I have tried to write this poem in like just in a non-visual kind of way. I feel like I've been trying to do that for the last couple of years. Um, and I feel like get so caught up in trying to describe what I mean, that I feel like having the image here and being able to physically see the distance between the spaces, um, it's a much faster way of getting to the meaning than like trying to explain this in sentence form alone. Oh, I think you're on mute, Alan.
Thank you. I didn't realize that you had been working on something like this for some time. And since I'm hearing you talking about the immediacy of it, like I also would recommend that you consider, so you have this um, line right there, right? I really would say, think about most Black people here live on the East Side. For me, if I were an editor and you turned this in for me as a poem, and you were like, this is a poem, I would be like, great. My feedback for you would be, okay, think about, you have this one line and it seems most Black people here live on the East Side. And here seems to be really important because you give us a map. And I would be like, I would encourage you to like make here either larger or all caps, or literally draw a line to where the here is on the map. Or if it's the entire, this whole radius, to just be like, oh, maybe you want to add a circle over that so that we know that exactly the whole thing is the here. But also because we're living in a surveillance state, if you're like, fuck that, like, that's not feedback that makes sense for me because I don't want more surveillance or policing in this part, I would be like, and if you don't want more policing or surveillance, then maybe have a larger map of San Antonio and just the one line, make it be over that neighborhood, but don't really indicate where the here is. And people will just assume that you randomly just drop that line there in order to like work against surveillance technology, but also like keep the poem in the way that you originally sent it in, right? So the way visual poetry works is about, it's not about, is this legible? It's about, is this what you wanted to communicate to yourself? Like a lot of the times when we think about poetry, we're like, oh, but what are readers going to think? How are people going to receive it? And I'm like, okay, first of all, like the reader, while the reader is important, um, we don't necessarily, as I mean, I'm gonna talk about we because I feel like you and I are like in similar alignment. Like we don't write to be read. I think that the two of us sometimes write because we wish that these narratives or these worlds that we're architecting or building or trying to imagine would have been there for us when we were younger. And I think also like a lot of Evie Shockley's poems are about denouncing a violence so that other worlds can be built. Um, like don't pay so much attention to the reader, uh, and don't pay attention to like, oh, can I bring this into a poetry workshop? Like stay outside of the academy, stay within the self. What is your goal? A lot of the times when we think about poetry, we don't ask ourselves, what is my goal in this poem? Particularly, like, I don't think any of us have asked you, what is your goal in the poem that you wrote during one of our live streams? And maybe we should have. But right now, for the next 10 minutes, I want you to choose one of the two prompts that you wrote about. And I want you to do what Ariana and I just did, but for your own prompt. Think about, how do you want to visually represent? What one visual do you want to kind of highlight? And I'm going to go back to the Google Doc. And there are 4 things that I want you to consider. So number 1 is the font. Think of the page as a landscape, not the landscape size, but just kind of like, it's is part of the world, right? What does the home of that page look like? How much structure? How wide? How long? Um, in Evie's poem, if I go back to the first one that I showed you with the X, oh my gosh. Ah, okay, give me 1 second to find this poem.
And y'all can also look in the comments on the YouTube live chat. We were trying to figure out how to add a text box into Google Docs a little bit ago, and you can actually do it by going to Insert Drawing, and then but you have to type in the text box first, and then you hit Save and Close, and it should show up. So y'all can work on your visual poem in Canva, but you can also do it in Google Docs. And if you need help on that process, we can drop the steps in the live chat as well.
Thank you so much, Ariana. And I'll also, after this live is over, if you go back to the Google Drive, I'll drop in a link of how to make an image, a watermark, so that you can just write over the image without having to use a text box. So in X marks the spot, like there is quite a bit of negative space here and negative space up here. So there's like a lot of white. So I really want you to think, how are you using the space? As a Black person, as a migrant, as a queer person, as somebody who was undocumented 17 years, my relationship to space is like almost non-existent because I felt like my entire life I could not move, I could not breathe, I could not like leave anywhere without like facing potential like detainment. So one thing that I've really committed myself to is I need to exercise my right to mobility in poetry. Like I try to be as messy as I can on the page. I want you to critically think about space. If you live in a body that being in public space is sometimes triggering or makes you anxious, primarily right now in this pandemic, or like patriarchy makes moving in certain bodies really opaque, peculiar. Just think about the actual space. If you can reclaim space on the page, how would you do it? So think, and number two, images. Is there a single image that encapsulates this piece? I wrote about like the protests that are happening in Oakland right now and in relationship to the Black Panther movement and the pigs. And I really like the image of the pig. So maybe I would drop an image of a pig and just like right on top of it. Because I'm just like, yeah, let me like talk about the image of Black folk, but also how the Black Panthers popularized the word the pigs through the Black Panthers newspapers, because all the policemen were always drawn as pigs in the newspapers. And that's one of the ways in which it really gained popularity in people's imagination. So yeah, so photographs. If you use a photograph, let's say if you're writing about your family and maybe you just want to like drop that photograph and pick lines and copy and paste them into the photograph, do you have permission to use this photograph? One thing that because we're such a social media world, we sometimes forget that photographs can harm. Photographs can re-trigger memories that maybe some people don't want to remember, triggers or things that people don't want to be circulating. So do you have permission to use that photograph? And maybe sometimes you have a lot of words, but a photograph can actually replace most of the words. Can you, instead of using all that text space you just used, can you actually replace it with a photograph? If you're describing a photograph in a poem, why not just drop the photograph and then move on and continue the poem? There is no need for us to be like, oh, look at how many words I know. Like, girl, just drop the photograph. um, yeah, so, and the fourth thing I want you to think about is opacity. And opacity is the right not to know. Who are you writing for?
feel free to blur out words. Ariana, you said that the second prompt you kept crossing stuff out. I would actually really encourage you to keep all those crossouts because it tells us something. The crossout is a somatic response. It's an anxiety. It's a, this is not quite right. Show us that language was not right when you were writing this piece. Um, because that is part of the poem, the not right. And I think that sometimes we desire like neatness. We desire precision in a world that is not neat, in a world that is not precise. We move away from chaos, but we're living in a moment of chaos. So I really encourage you all to think critically. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes, and this live is going to be different. We're not going to bring people in. What I'm going to ask is for any of you who want to share your images to send us an actual image on Instagram, and I can like for the next like hour or 2 hours after this live, I can post all the images you sent. So that way we can kind of create this archive of the visual poems you produced today. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes to play on a Google Doc or on your notebook or on a Canva page and take one of the two prompts that you already wrote. Don't add more writing. Honor the visual, play with the visual. So I'm going to time 10 minutes and I'm going to put some music. So we are coming to an end of our 10 minutes. I think I may have given you 9 or 8, but it's okay. In the chat, if y'all can just say a sentence or a few words on if you are able to engage a visual aspect to your piece, that would be great. And while you're doing that, I want to ask Ariana. Ariana, how was that writing for you?
It was interesting. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get like the exact right image because I was taking images from Google Maps. I was trying to figure out how much do I crop out, like of the structure of the city. San Antonio is like the design of the city is kind of strange and unique in that like the two major highways in the city are concentric circles that don't intersect. So I was like, do I include the outer highway that like shows where the suburbs of San Antonio are, or do I just focus on like the inner loop highway? So trying to figure out like making those decisions, like what do I keep in the map and what do I so I can zoom in on certain areas, and then what do I leave? What do I crop out of the map? So I spent a lot of time figuring that out. And then I struggled a little bit in Google Docs trying to figure out how to write on the image. So I was switching over to Canva, which I think was just a little easier for me doing this particular exercise. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, I don't think I can write like a whole poem on this one image. I do think it's going to be a series of maybe me like repeating that image, and maybe blowing it up in certain areas, or maybe just keeping it the same, and putting text in different places. And I was also thinking about like, as the image reappears, what pieces of text will stay on it and which ones do I want to like leave out so I can make room for other things. So it opened up a lot of possibilities, I think, and just makes me want to spend more time with this one image in particular. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing and trusting and kind of just going with it. I'm super excited to hear this idea of the repetition of images. In a way, it reminds me a little bit of, I think it's Sacha Banks' American Mind, where the square image repeats for a few pages, the square. So yeah. Ooh. Okay, people are typing. Alexis got an image, but I'm slow, so execution barely begun. Well, I highly recommend that if you have time today to continue, this is literally just the start. This workshop is about process. It's not necessarily about creating a single poem right now. It's about pushing you to explore another dimension of poetry. And Vaz, this was strangely the easiest workshop for me to follow through on. I think the visuals really help because I mostly think in images rather than words. Well, thank you for coming. I'm really excited. Hopefully you can send us something on our Instagram. A bunch of tiny deer. I love this way of processing my words visually, especially because I usually self-edit my words so much that adding the visual aspect helped me have more faith in the words themselves. Wow. Thank you. Okay. And if anybody else wants to drop in a comment, please do so. I wrote in my notebook. I made like the little pig. Hold on, it's so bright. See, I made a little pig and then I wrote under the pig. Yeah, okay. I feel kind of odd closing it off, but Ariana, is there anything you want to say?
Yeah, thank you for this, Alan. This is really cool, and I feel like as someone who like primarily entered poetry in like performance spaces where you don't think about what the poem looks like on the page, I feel like this was really helpful to think about as well, because in my experience, like a lot of people who have talked about the possibilities of the page are mostly talking about like line breaks, and so getting to think about like how a poem can appear on a page in a very different kind of way was really useful for my process. And if it was useful for you too, this is me trying to segue. I feel like this workshop should be shared with more people. And so if this workshop was useful for you, please send this link to people you know who might benefit from it. We haven't had a lot of people with us live during this workshop, but I feel like it would be beneficial to a lot of people's writing processes. As well, if you feel moved and you have a few extra funds, you can find Alan's Venmo and Cash App information in the description box below the YouTube video. And we'll put it here as well. Alan is at Migrant Scribble on Cash App and Venmo. And please, like Alan said, if you end up like working more on the piece that you started today and you would like for us to see it, since we didn't get to really share what we created today, since this was more about process, like Alan said, please send us a DM on Instagram and let us know if you want us to repost it on the Instagram feed. I feel like it would be helpful for a lot of people to see other visual examples of what people have created. So even if you're in the process of figuring out what your thing is, we would still love to see it. And maybe that would also help jumpstart other people's writing process. So thank you for joining us for this particular workshop. I feel like it's very different than what we've done before. So yeah, that's my segue. Alan, do you have anything?
Yeah, no, thank you everybody for joining. I'm excited that this workshop happened because I don't think I've really ever done something like I've done something kind of like this, but in person, and in person is so much easier because I have photocopies of all the poems and I put them on the wall and I have people walk and like look at them on the wall. So this was cool. Yeah, like Ariana said, the series, I think it's really dope. So please send it out to others. Really do follow us on Instagram, and our Venmos are on the description. And I will upload instructions on the Google Doc on how to make stuff watermark so you can write over them and then delete the image and just keep your writing. Because sometimes if you like, let's say you drop in an image of, like for me, like let's say I dropped in the image of the pig and then I drop in my paragraph and then I space out my paragraph to the shape of the pig, I can then delete the image of the pig and then it'll just be my words making the shape of the pig, which is something I will do later once I transcribe this onto the computer. But yeah, I'll put in instructions for that. So yeah, thank you for coming and we will see you next Sunday. Yeah.
Okay, really quick. That's super cool. Really quick. Next Sunday, I will be facilitating the workshop. We will be working on flyers for the July workshops that are coming up. So just because you don't see anything on the Instagram yet, we're still meeting next Sunday. We will still have workshops through the end of July. Next Sunday's workshop is on silence, speaking, and power. So we're going to be thinking about, getting back to figuring out why do we write? What are our motivations for doing that? And how do we make sure that our politics are clear in both what we write and outside of our writing? So that will be next week. So we will see you next Sunday right here. Keep an eye on the Instagram for the link. And we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, that's my turn, right?